Hello and welcome all back to Election Time News America. Today is Sunday, July 6th, 2025. We're going to be looking at the 2026 United States midterm elections, which are going to take place on November 3rd, 2026. Now, with the passing of the One Big Beautiful Bill, which I will now just be referring to for simplicity as H.R.1, which was the congressional bill number that it was given as just the first passed for the 119th Congress. It's short for House Resolution 1, which recycles every single time there's a new Congress. So, election time news, your one stop for all things elections and politics, from summations to poll reviews and news. Subscribe below for more content like this about American, Canadian, and Australian elections, with Australian elections in mind. I will be very, very soon getting into the 2025 Tasmanian state elections. There is finally now some polling here. Mainly going to be looking at the YouGov polls. They were relatively accurate, but I will be looking a bit at Demos AU as well. It's going to be very interesting, but we're finally going to be getting into this as there now finally is some polling, and we're getting a bit closer to Election Day, which is in just a very short, a pretty short 13 days out. So I'm finally be able to get to that relatively soon. And also make sure to follow the Substack, Threads, Instagram, and X. Those are all linked on my profile, as well as all across my other platforms. They're all across linked. And so remember, there's never a dull moment in politics. Now, there is one more update. I am going to be officially launching. There was a little tidbit in the election night video, the alt-his scenario of today in politics, election time news, but I'm officially launching that as a podcast. It's not going to be daily. It's probably going to be more weekly or so, and it's going to be more interesting things that have happened in Canada, Australia, and America. There's going to be quote unquote chapters in each one, and so I'm going to be publishing that on Substack mostly, but also be sharing that to YouTube as well, and that will most likely be weekly. I'm not 100% sure how the schedule will work out. That is all to be determined as of right now, but that is just that main announcement. So, now officially getting into the video here, we have the current Senate map as of right now, unless there's more special elections that come out before Election Day. This is the 2026 Senate map, and this is the 2026 House map. Now, it's a little bit different than that. This is the super safe map that I made before the last video that I did over this. These are the map. These are the seats that are absolutely 100% going to go one way or the other. That means they have consistently gone very, very strongly for the one candidate that is colored that way or the other. The only thing that isn't determined on this map actually is the state of Ohio, which will have its map redrawn unless the state Congress can't agree, and then the courts can't actually find a map that's better suited than the previous one. It is a weird system. But then it would go back and to the map that happened last cycle, which is probably most likely what's honestly going to happen, or if Texas gets redrawn, which would be more for the benefit of the Republicans than anything else, even though it's already a pretty gerrymandered map. It's one of the worst ones in the country. Is if you look at this popular vote breakdown, 40% here, but then this line is strongly over here, and if you look at 2018, this was a bit concerning for the Republicans. This is what made them redraw it again. But even then, that was a large vote disparity, and it still was done so again this cycle, and not so much in 2022, but that's when they redrew the maps. And so now in 2024, it's still pretty poor. It could potentially get worse. And the real problem with this is the lack of elasticity. While there's only about two seats that are wrong, every single Republican seat, the worst one was by 14.2. So that means that you'd have to move the map by 14.2% in order to make the first one flip, and that's the 15th district. And if you're moving it by 14 points, then the Democrats are now getting 54% of the popular vote compared to Republicans. Not exactly, because you have to divide by 2, so it should be 7 0.1. But anyway, it's a mess in Texas, so that could potentially be getting worse. It's about as bad as Illinois is. Balance in favor for the Democrats. They're likely not redrawing that either, unfortunately. So we should really be getting to see quite a bit. I believe my requirement was reaching, yeah, I think it was 70%. If they win with at least 70% of the vote in their district, then they go to the super safe one. And that is including this one, even though it was two Republicans, because Washington has statewide nonpartisan primaries. But if you look over here, it was strong enough red that I did actually end up including it. So with all that there, here's the super safe map. A lot of these are actually basically completely safe, though. There's a lot all throughout a lot of these regions as well that are basically entirely for one party or the other, and they haven't gone one way or the other for a long, long time. So basically, there's not much true competitiveness in the majority of these districts. I did not mean to do that. But, I mean, in theory, North Carolina could go, but all of these are going to be likely. Not margin-wise. Right now, we're doing, for this map, we're going to do percentage-wise. That's the blue one. My bad. That's the blue one. So, while we're going through here, these are all safe. We're going to be talking about the big, beautiful bill, H.R.1, which did pass through the House recently, and was also put on Donald Trump's desk on the 4th. And so with that, basically, you end up with actually a bit of a misalignment here. I'm going to be getting over to the statistics in a minute. That's good for right now. As the opinion, according to the Fox News poll, this is basically the only one poll that was actually released for it, but it's a relatively low margin of error. Oppose plus, that is 19. So, 21. I was doing it backwards. 21% more people opposed the bill than favored it. And also, almost a majority of respondents thought that it would hurt their family more than any other response. Barely not. So, 23% said they thought it would help. 26% said they would make no difference. And only 60% said they'd understand what was in H.R.1. But interestingly, voters who said they had a good understanding of what was in it were more likely to favor the legislation than those who were unfamiliar with it. But the more still thought it would hurt rather than help, which would be 45 for hurt, 34 for help. Interestingly, the make no difference was much, much lower for the people who thought they knew what was in the bill. So, also, you have worsening numbers for Trump's job performance in this same poll. The overall job performance is down by 8. He's only positive in border security. Immigration, he lost his positive rating. He had that for a long time. And inflation, he's down by 30. So that's a concern there. So this is going to be mainly based off of the going to affect the national environment for the midterms. It's going to be for the Senate as well as the House. 2.3 generic congressional vote as of right now. If you look at 2018's general congressional vote was by 8. It was a D+8 national environment. So that was where Tim Walz's seat was. He went to governor. But anyway, what's the other one? And literally all the other ones were just because Pennsylvania's map got redrawn. So, and Minnesota's 8th. Okay. And that was a non-incumbent. So not a single Republican incumbent managed to... No Democratic incumbents lost in 2018. And that was a D+8 national environment. So the question coming into 2026 would be, is that going to get better or worse? We're also going to be looking at, the fact that the House map... There we go. The fact that the House map is... I didn't know that. Okay. That's one I didn't know about. You got Don Bacon, who recently retired, announced he's going to retire. Oh, here, you literally have an entire list. Andy Biggs retiring to run for governor. Run for U.S. Senate. Buddy Carter, yeah. Run for governor in Iowa. Andy Barr to run for U.S. Senate. Um, Don Bacon's retiring. John James retiring to run for governor as well. Dusty Johnson, okay. And then John Rhodes retiring to run for governor as well. So all of those, as well as some of these districts in these other ones. So now you end up with, of course, you have, Chris Pappas. We've been talking about that a lot. And Angie Craig. These two are going to be talking about a lot more, as these two are the very competitive Senate races, which we'll be getting to in a minute, as the both of them have a Democrat retiring, an incumbent, and that was after a relatively okay performance. If you look at the results, so officially to start things off on the Senate map, we're going to be looking at the safe states. So that's going to be Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota, Oklahoma. Kansas is now officially in that range. Laura Kelly recently officially doubled down that she is not running for another office, so that is completely closed. Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. All of those, there are more than a. These are going to be based off of margins this time. These are most likely all, and actually in that case, then we're not going to have Mississippi as safe red. I'll explain that in a minute. But all of these are expected to go by over 10 points for these candidates. There's not much of a chance that they're going to be able to end up pulling out a win. Toss up means I can't decide a winner, and I will explain that in a bit, and then I'll actually do a slight probability explanation based on the sheet. So these are all basically going to be 10 or more points for the Republicans at the end of the day. And if you look at the Democratic side, Oregon is going to be the first one that they're going to have here. Colorado is narrowly going to be most likely over 10, but I wouldn't be surprised. Illinois, Delaware, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. And that's it for the Democrats, interestingly enough, for a safe over 10 point. Now, Virginia is going to be interesting. That one's most likely going to be over 10 points, but as of right now, we can't necessarily say that it's going to be certain. And that's mainly just because of the fact that there still is a chance here that, assuming that Mark Warner does in fact end up running, if Glenn Youngkin hops into the race, then it's definitely going to get very, very close. I still would say that Mark Warner would be favored because he is a strong candidate here. He overperformed by 6.5 points in 2020 for his Senate race. So that's a strong showing right there. He'd be the incumbent, so he'd have to outperform plus a D-5. So then you end up with a Glenn Youngkin. Would he be able to beat out an 11.5 point overperformance here from the baseline, which is already 7.8? That just seems very, very difficult. So it might not be. Glenn Youngkin's the only chance that the Republicans have in Virginia, but even if he does go in, I find it very difficult that even he would actually be able to perform all that well in this national environment. But overall, Mark Warner isn't a hyper strong candidate, so there's, in theory, a chance that he could end up doing just okay in that race there. It completely depends on who the Republican candidate ends up being. And even though Virginia, again, 7.8 and then a 5, that would be a 12-point race, it does really end up coming down to how the Senate national environment comes up being, which is most likely to be much redder because you don't have New York or California to balance out those Republican votes. So actually, the national environment being -5 is actually incorrect. For the Senate, it would probably be closer to maybe minus 0.5 or so, which means that there's actually going to be a lot less of difficulty here, and this is already a good bit better than 2020. As you can see, that was 2.25 points for the Republicans. So That's just a bad map, just because there's Texas here, you have Florida, but you don't have New York or California for strong Democratic votes. So that's why that ended up being 2.25 points for the Republicans on the same ballot. That in 2020 it was actually D+3 for the congressional general. So, with that all out of the way, now we end up going to the likely states in the Senate. This is going to be the states that are going to most likely, as of right now, be between 5 and 10 points. Relatively strong performance for each candidate. That's going to be New Mexico in there as well. You have Virginia, as I said, and Minnesota for the Democrats. Oh, we're going off of margin. Montana's going to be red. Solid red. Then you end up having Mississippi. I'll be into that in a minute. You have Ohio, Nebraska, Alaska, Florida. So all of those most likely are actually going to be under 10 points. So to start things off in Alaska, this is a Dan Sullivan is the one of two. They're both Republican candidates here, but looking over at the general congressional vote here, Trump's job approval is continuing to drop. Economist YouGov -8, Yahoo News -9, Qantas Insights even -2, -3, -1, -9, -13, but it is Quinnipiac, +1, but it is Rasmussen. So it's a little bit back and forth. But yeah, it's been consistently it's actually been the disapproval has been dropping a bit recently, but it is still a bit of a it's not going too well. It is still better than it was compared to his first term, though. And direction of the country is slightly wrong track by about 10.5 points here. Economist YouGov actually had -18, which would be up towards about half of where it was right before his inauguration. And if you look at where it was in 2020, right before Biden was elected, it was at -44, and then it plummeted right after he took office. So we're just seeing the exact same thing right after a presidential change. It tends to plummet. And so, but if you look at the numbers right around now in 2016, so that's when Trump took office, it kind of dropped right after that. And then you started getting into 2018. It wasn't that poor in 2018. So this is showing a potential of a 2018 environment, and congressional job approval is in the gutter. But it all basically always is. Congress is never really that approved of. You look at 2018, you end up with -57 going into election day, -52, -54. So actually, we're relatively doing better right now than usual. So that's all very interesting to see, but those aren't necessarily positive signs, especially with dropping numbers. Every single person here is underwater. Um, and so, top concerns, very concerned about the future of the country, 85%, inflation, higher prices, 84, government spending, 80, Iran with nukes, 78, anti-Semitism, 70, illegal immigration, 67. So that top issue for the Trump campaign is now much, much lower. Inflation is number 2. And what was found up here is that people do not trust him on that. So that is another issue that could end up coming up for the Republicans come 2026. And so Dan Sullivan here isn't that strong of a candidate. He didn't underperform by much, though. He's basically a baseline candidate here. But he did vote for the bill, so that could potentially harm him based on how things end up going. Then you go into Nebraska. This one's mostly just because of the possibility that you could end up having still Dan Osborne jumping in as an independent. This one's really going to be interesting. Pete Ricketts was only beating Osborne by 1. This was done by Osborne's exploratory campaign, though, so that's a bit of a bit biased. But that's really going to end up being based off of whether or not Osborne ends up running. That could either end up being over 20, or it could end up being lean even tilt. So it all depends on that. Just as a compromise, I'm going to put it in likely. Mississippi, this is an interesting one. Hyde Smith is not a very popular candidate. Very strong underperformer. Underperformed by 14 compared to a generic in 2020. So staying in the race is actually going to be rough for the Republicans, as you end up getting 22 minus a half to be 21 and a half, and then 14. Just do the simple math here. You end up with this plus this for the national environment, you know, with 21 and a half. And then what's the underperformance looking like? 7.2. So that's already not a strong result for any candidate here, if we just want to do a very simple guess for all of these. But of course, that's not necessarily always true because we don't have incumbencies in some of these, so they're not. But already again in Alaska, 10 points for that estimation. So what we're looking at here is going to be the fact. So then we have -1, but again he's retiring, so that's going to be another issue. So Dan Sullivan's not wow. Dan Sullivan, I already went back. So not sassy. He ended up getting replaced. Ricketts was elected for the first time in the special election in 2024. So he's not even necessarily, this would be his first time running as officially on a main ticket. So he's most likely not going to do that well, but again, that's going to be a compromise between those two there. Ohio, this one's going to be definitely on the higher side. This is a special election for the remainder of J.D. Vance's seat. He only won by 6.1 in 2022 as is, and that was basically an even year. Republicans won by 0.1, and so he really underperformed a good bit of expectations there. But that is now basically an open seat. There is an unelected incumbent, special election down here if you want to end up doing that, but you don't have any numbers here, so it's not going to be the exact same. But if you're doing that, that's going to be 10. That's really not going to be anything impressive by any means. There's not really much that you can glean based off of this because you don't have any information on the performance. But currently, sitting Senator John Husted is not necessarily too strong of a candidate from what I've seen. He does relatively well where he needs to, but he's not a strong overperformer. And the same is not necessarily to be said for Ashley Moody in Florida. That's for the remainder of Marco Rubio's seat before he got into the Trump administration as well. Ashley Moody is a relatively strong candidate. She did very well when she was. Let me see if I can pull up her page real quick. In her election. Oh, great. And so if you look at the attorney general race, the 38th, okay, she did very well with her election here in the attorney general race. I can't pull it up real quick apparently, but let's see if I can get this. Resign from the court. There we go. Yeah, she won by a relatively strong amount, got reelected in 2022 by a landslide alongside the same ticket, but she actually, I believe, overperformed DeSantis. For example, she won Palm Beach County when he lost it, if I'm correct. She breached 60%, so she's a relatively strong performer. But Florida, that would be 11.4 points. She's a relatively strong candidate, so I'm right on the edge here, depending on how things go. If we get one single poll that has her up by double digits, I think that might be enough to get it up to safe. But there's also very weak Democratic fields right now, so it's really not going to take much, but I don't see enough as of literally right now to say it's going to be safe. Ohio, we do have the unelected incumbent as well in John Husted, so that's going to be, again, relatively strong candidate there. Completely depends on who ends up running for the Democrats. Next, we have the lean races, starting off in Maine. This is just because the Democrats have not fielded any strong candidates, and now we basically just have a 5.8 for the expected margin. She's a very strong overperformer. So based on that, she's expected to win by 5.8 points. I think it's actually going to be worse than that, potentially, especially in Maine, based off of all of these, which are going to be worse in Maine since it's a blue tilted state. So it's probably going to be just under 5 points, if anything, but she is likely still to hold on, even with all of that in mind. Next up is going to be Iowa, another underperformer here in Joni Ernst. Only expected to win by 3.7 based off of this. So she underperformed by 8.7. Again, she also made that very controversial comment. I'm still not sure that's going to be enough to make her lose. There's a few polls, interestingly, There's quite a few Democrats that have actually gone into the field. J.D. Scholten, Zach Walls, um, as well. But there's no real. She only beat generic Democrats by two, but with a lot of undecideds, and they tend to go with where the state goes on the presidential level. It's a general rule for polling. So that is going to be lean for our margin map, but still, she is likely to win that race in the end, which means that Republicans will absolutely retain their majority in the Senate. Then we go down to Texas. It's going to be another one that's going to be lean. This is because of the undecidedness. Cornyn is being primaried, and with that, he's going to have to spend some of his war chest. So that's definitely going to harm the Republicans here. And also, officially, Colin Allred has officially jumped into the race. Believe it or not, he was actually an overperformer in the 2024 election. The national environment for the Senate was slightly Democratic, but that's mostly because of California, New York, Maryland, Massachusetts, all weighing that in. Texas, he also did relatively well. That was a large poll there. So it was narrowly Democratic. That is 1.4 point uh, national environment, and so he only that's a 9. That's R plus 9.6 in the end. And if you look at Texas down here, you end up with 11.9. So it's not that big of an overperformance, but he did still overperform a generic Democrat. So that may not be the worst possible number to look at. And you look down here, 6.9 for the number here, that's without any polling. And if you actually look at the polling that was done out of Texas, why did I just close that? The polling that was done out of Texas, then you end up seeing that John Cornyn was leading Allred by only 4, and Paxton by was only leading him by 2, with 6% undecided. So that definitely is enough to actually bump it down below that 5-point margin, which would be more along the lines of I don't think I'm actually going to get to the House. More on the lines of a 2020 numbers as well. 2018 against Cruz. So that's definitely going to end up impacting things a lot. So then we end up going to the state of New Hampshire. This is another one that's likely going to be lean blue. It's a blue state on the general level. 18.4, but a lot of that's going to be this right here, which I didn't add any preclusion for. So that's going to be a lot lower than that. So, because Jean Shaheen is retiring, that's definitely going to hurt the Democrats by a good bit. She greatly overperformed 15.6. You can see that is a 13-point overperformance compared to what would be expected. It would be expected that with a 2.25 and 4.1 PVI, that would be closer to around flat 2. Just less than 2, and she ended up winning by 12. But it is still a Democratic state, and it's expected to be a blue year in general. So, and you don't really have any strong Republican candidates here. Kelly Ayotte and Chris Sununu are both not running. Chris Sununu not running might have been one of the worst bits of news for the Republicans all cycle, along with the news in Georgia, which we're getting to next. Scott Brown isn't a poor candidate. He won a special election in Massachusetts, but you do have Chris Pappas, who is already a relatively strong candidate in his own right. He did win in the 1st district in 2024 by 8.1%, after winning also by 8.1 in 2022. So he's a relatively strong candidate, and he should be able to win this seat. Then we go to the other lean seat, which is going to be the state of Georgia. This is a very sad news for the Democrats. Win by 4 for current incumbent Jon Ossoff, and this is mostly just due to the fact there's no real very strong Republican candidates. They do have Buddy Carter, who's most likely going to be able to get the nomination. He's a relatively strong candidate, but the best one would have absolutely been Brian Kemp, but he announced that he is not running, even though he is the outgoing governor, and he greatly overperformed. So that is definitely going to hurt. I don't have any information on that there, but I will soon. I have to build that up the same that I did here. Actually, I might just duplicate this and put it over here at this point. But then we end up with a relatively poor turnout here for the Republicans. This was a potential flip that they could have gotten as Donald Trump won it. But it is also a relatively unfavorable seat for them, or state for them as well, as it's shifting hard to the left. One of the highest trends in the entire country for the Democrats. That is going to be the second highest for a state, more so than Kansas, interestingly enough. So that is definitely going to be of some concern for the Republicans, as if most likely they can't win it this cycle. It's going to be almost impossible to win it in the future unless they have a red wave. So then we get down to the final two. We have Michigan and North Carolina. These two are probably going to be the most decisive now at this point. Michigan is going to be the first big one here. Both of them actually have incumbents retiring, so we have both of them now have open races, and because of that, these are now going to be the two biggest to look at. So looking first in the state of Michigan, Gary Peters is retiring, and Donald Trump won it by 1.4%, which was half of how much Joe Biden won it by in 2020. And so we do have a few Democratic candidates, but none of them are very strong candidates. So that's going to be the main concern here. And Mike Rogers, on the other hand, is actually a relatively strong candidate. He won in Michigan's 8th district somewhat recently by 8th. John James is running for governor. The 8th district is going to be... he might have had it prior. Looks like he had it at some point prior to that when the numbers were drawn in a different way, but not 100% sure where it is. No, that was Alyssa Slotkin's seats. I'm not sure. I must have misread that. So until 2015. So it was a while ago. Nominee for U.S. Senate in 2024. This is the concerning part, though. In 2024, Alyssa Slotkin narrowly beat him, and that was by 19,000 votes out of, that's going to be well over 5.3 million cast. So just over a third of a point. He's a very strong performer, so that's going to be of somewhat concern, and they also don't have the benefit of Gary Peters being a strong overperformer by 4.5. They actually could have expected that it would actually have gone red in 2020, but Gary Peters managed to overperform there. So this is going to be a very, very narrow seat. As of right now, it would have to be toss-up on margins, but based on chance alone and all that, we do have a slight national environment that's favorable towards Democrats, but not enough to beat the PVI here. And we don't have an overperformer anymore, and we also have a poor field. So with that, for chances narrowly going to go to the Republicans, unless the Democrats can end up picking up a strong candidate here. They don't really have any strong candidates. Haley Stevens is beating Mike Rogers, but we're going to have to get a bit more into this. El Sayed is losing to Rogers, though, and he's most likely going to be the candidate. So that's the problem here. If Stevens ends up winning the candidacy, then we might end up seeing a better shape up for the Democrats. But as long as we end up having one candidate who's barely neck and neck, and one who's looking like they're more likely to be the candidate that is losing, then we're going to have to definitely leave this in the tilt Republican column. Then we go to North Carolina. This is interestingly the exact opposite. Thom Tillis is retiring, and he was actually an underperformer. -1 for the number here. He underperformed by 2.3 in 2020. He only won by 1.7, and this was also against a scandal-plagued candidate. So this would have potentially been a very difficult, this would have been a very difficult race. He now doesn't actually have to face the primary. He was potentially facing a primary challenge against Lara Trump, who had threatened to primary him, but now they actually don't. Don Brown is most likely, as of right now, to be the candidate. 8th Congressional District was the district down here. He apparently didn't win the actual nomination, but he does have some recognition. And so then from there, we do end up... there's not many strong Republican candidates either. So that's the main problem here, is you then, if you just remove this, then you end up with a 1.3. That's just as strong as Ohio and Florida, and there's no real numbers here. if you scroll down to the polling, Roy Cooper, if Roy Cooper ends up jumping into this race, then things would get very, very strong for the Democrats. Lara Trump was losing by 2 with 10% undecided, which would generally break for Republicans a bit. But Tom Tillis was getting basically consistently beaten by Cooper. But now, of course, that doesn't really matter anymore. This is absolutely another pure battleground, just as much as Michigan. But if there's a state that Republicans are going to flip, it's going to be Michigan. And the main 2 states that Democrats might flip are North Carolina and Maine. And as of right now, it looks best that they're going to be able to flip North Carolina, even though, interestingly, it hasn't gone blue on the Senate level going back since 2008 when Hagan beat Dole, who was actually Bob Dole's wife. And then, so it's really going to be it's going to be competitive all cycle long. This is probably the biggest state to watch is going to be North Carolina, because now Georgia is going to be less competitive, and Michigan, while it is looking a bit more concerning for the Democrats, as if you look here, with 0.2 now, it's still not going to be quite as interesting as North Carolina, and very, very rarely do you end up winning by a considerable amount. Now, of course, 20 these years are weird. The Democrats gained 3, even though they lost the popular vote. But California and New York aren't there. But here in 2014, they won by 7, and they flipped 9 seats. So again, that's really going to be difficult for and that's Purdue, who lost to Ossoff. That's really going to be a difficult run for the Republicans in Michigan, but that is definitely their best flip. And if I had to say, sleeper flips would definitely be, for the Republicans, would definitely be New Hampshire, going to be their number 1 pick there. And for the Democrats, is going to be Iowa, because there's a strong field there of competent candidates in both of them. In New Hampshire, Scott Brown isn't a poor candidate by any means. It's not that strong of a Democratic state. Chris Pappas isn't an overexceeder by any means, and in Iowa you have a competent Democratic field of multiple relatively strong candidates, including the one of these state senator from 43rd District, Senate Minority Leader, representative from the 1st District, Iowa's 4th Congressional District. Okay, but he ran in the 4th Congressional District, which was this reddest one over here, which, interestingly, if you go back to 2018, was only 3, and there's Scholten. So he's already run relatively well in some of those candidates, for example, and also Walz was also the Senate Minority Leader. So that's another large name recognition in the state. And then you have Nathan Sage, who is probably the weakest of these candidates. But then you also have, now you could say, a relatively poor candidate in Joni Ernst. She definitely underperformed. She had that controversial statement, and she also has a Senate challenger, which means she's also going to have to spend on her war chest on that. Now, it's not going to be that strong. She even beat someone else in the hypothetical polling in the primaries, but it still is going to be an uphill battle there to some extent. That's going to be the main sleeper flip for the Democrats. For the Republicans, again, it's going to be New Hampshire. So thank you so much for watching today's video. This was, again, longer than I thought. I'll probably end up getting to the house soon-ish next video. So I was planning to only get to the Senate today anyway. So thank you all so much, Shay, for watching, and have a fantastic rest of your day.